there are two aspects of Paul's teaching here that I want to highlight. The dispute over food and drink, and then the whole question of imitating Paul. Where does he get off saying that? So let's start with the food or drink, though, because that's the background. If you read through 1 Corinthians chapter 10 as a whole, in other words, if you back up all the way to verse 1 and you read through the entire chapter, you'll see that one of the conflicts that lies behind the chapter is the question of eating food that has been sacrificed to idols. Right? Now, in order to get that context clear, it's important to recall once again that Corinth is a Greek city predominantly inhabited by pagans, by Gentiles, and that one of the ways ancient pagan temple cults worked is that certain foods, certain animals that would be sacrificed or consecrated to impart to this or that god or goddess in the various temples throughout the city, some of that meat would then make its way to the marketplace and be sold, right, for people to consume. So, in other words, the grocery, the markets for food and drink were tied up with the temple cults and the religious services of the various pagan deities in the city. So, one of the early pastoral problems that Christians dealt with in the early church is whether a baptized Christian, think here of a Gentile who's now become a believer in Christ, should continue to purchase and eat meat that was sold at the marketplace, which may or may not have been sacrificed to Zeus or Apollo or Aphrodite or, one of these different deities. And if in purchasing such meat and eating such meat, they would be in some way remotely participating or approximately participating in the pagan temple cults. In other words, would they be supporters of idolatry if they ate food that was sacrificed to idols that they had purchased in the temple markets? So Paul has a whole discussion of this in chapter 10, starting in verse 18. And he says this, I'll just give you a little bit of background here. Again, this isn't in the lectionary for today, but it's important to know it. He says, "Consider the practice of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" All right, so pause here. Notice Paul's first point is, if you're a baptized Christian, you cannot go to the temple cult and actually drink the offerings, drink the cup of demons. Because what pagans sacrifice, they're not just sacrificing to like imaginary gods and goddesses. There are actual, real, malevolent forces behind those deities. Right? So with the pagan sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons. And you can't drink the cup of the Lord, meaning the Eucharistic chalice, right? The cup of the blood of Christ, and drink the cup of a demon as well. Can't do it. You can't participate in both. If you do, you'll provoke the Lord to jealousy. All right? So on the one hand, there's no going to the temple cults, just like there's no going to the brothels in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. On the other hand, when it comes to food that had been sacrificed to the deities, but now was being sold in the market, Paul shifts his tune. Listen to this. Verse 23. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's, and everything in it. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising the question on the ground of conscience. So pause there. Notice what's Paul saying. You can't drink the cup of demons. You can't go to the temple cult and participate in the sacrifices. But when it comes to food offered in the marketplace, right? Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any problems about conscience. And if you have a pagan relative who invites you to their house and they set something before you, don't raise any questions about it on the ground of conscience, because all of the animals actually belong to God. Even a deer or bull or goat that might have been consecrated to some demon actually belongs to God, the meat that is sold in the market. However, now Paul shifts it the other direction. Verse 28. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, that out of consideration for the man who informed you and for conscience's sake, I mean his conscience, not yours, don't eat it. For why should my liberty be determined by another man's scruples? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So, and now we get to the verse we had for the reading today, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. So Paul's there. Notice, Paul has a complicated, it's a nuanced, but it's a reasonable pastoral strategy. When it comes to certain activities of proximate participation in the temple cult, right? Or direct participation, let's say, in temple cult, can't do it, right? When it comes to remote participation through eating a food that has been in the meat market, he says, don't raise any questions about it. You're free to eat it. However, if you're at someone's house and they bring to your attention that it was offered to some god, you should refrain from eating it, not because there's anything intrinsically wrong with it, but because you might scandalize that person and them thinking that you support the offering of sacrifices to these pagan deities. And he says, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do it for the glory of God and do it with thanksgiving. Okay? And then that's the context when he says, give no offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please all men in everything I do. So Paul has this fascinating pastoral strategy. There are certain things that he would allow for himself on the surface, right, intrinsically. Like he doesn't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with eating the meat that was sacrificed to this or that deity in the marketplace, especially if you don't know exactly its origins or where it came from. However, if you might put a stumbling block in front of someone else, if you might cause scandal, you should always try to avoid giving offense. So notice how nuanced already Paul's pastoral strategy is as he's dealing with these very practical issues in the early church that consisted of so many converts from Gentile paganism. And I think this is actually a great chapter that helps remind us that yes, Paul is the apostle. Yes, Paul is arguably the greatest theologian in the history of the church. But ultimately, too, Paul's pastor. He writes pastoral theology. He's writing as a pastor to this church. He's trying to shepherd this church through its pastoral, practical problems, issues, controversies, and moral decisions of how to make judgments and discern right and wrong in daily life in Corinth. So it's a fascinating window on the early church, and I think it has all kinds of implications for us in the modern world as we try to navigate living in secular society, which is some ways neo-pagan at times, right? And how to navigate our being in that society, but not of that society, participating in the market and in the economies of a secular society without at the same time scandalizing people or also being overly scrupulous, as Paul mentions here. So that's the first part. The second part, the one that really staggers me every time I read it, are those words, be imitators of me. I mean, think about Paul writing the letter to Corinth, right? He could